1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. I didn't actually check my sound before I pressed go live, as is the rush of today. So apologies if you can't hear me, but if you can, then let me know, because I'm a rather sensitive soul for stuff like that. Still not trusted the tech. It seems to be working fairly consistently, but then I still don't trust it. I'm Jack Chew, 12:30 weekdays. We chew it over, and this is the only show that this week that hasn't got a guest on, so you're going to be utterly disappointed, I imagine. But I've picked some interesting topics. And what I tend to do is I tend to look at some of the questions that come in and then sort of merge them and see what's of interest. I put them onto a little bit of a list and think, right, if there's a show that there's a gap, and then I'll fill it with that. And so there's some really interesting stuff that we're going to touch on today, some questions that came in. Clearly you can hear me okay. Katie said yes. Matt says it looks like a tasty topic for hump day. Yes, I'm feeling that pressure. I'm also feeling the pressure that this is the only show this week that hasn't got a guest on. And we know that that's why you tune in, really, for the actual experts. But one thing that I could be arguably an expert in is at least having an opinion on MSK CPD, of which I've been in that space now for coming on for 7 years. It's nearly 7 years since we launched Physio Matters. Certainly 7 years ago, we were in the thick of it. I think we first recorded an interview with Lee Harrington in May of 2013. So yeah, that's something that you should hope I've got some opinions on. Expertise, I don't know, but certainly that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. And so yeah, there's some juicy stuff. The other thing as well that came off our conversation with Jack March last Friday was I mentioned that I'm into sort of moral philosophy, evolutionary biology as being personal interests, hobbies, bit of an infovore in that space, and I feel like that overlaps significantly with my professional work and thinking and my different roles that I have. And so then some people have then asked how or what do I feel most relates and what sometimes doesn't. And so I'll come to that, which seems to be, you never know. I've got a couple of questions in that direction. It might well be that the rest of the audience aren't interested at all in that, but I'm going to give it a whirl and come to that, as well as some light reflections on the race relations roundtable that happened on Physio Matters live stream on Monday. Farouk Bello did an incredible job. Those that didn't hear Farouk on this show on Monday that night, he then did a roundtable discussion on diversity and inclusion in physiotherapy. As he mentioned in the intro, mainly focused in and around race relations at that point. And so I've got some thoughts on that, and a topic that naturally is going to need to be unpacked on this show and beyond ongoing. So I'm certainly just going to nod to a few thoughts and comments, but certainly something that I want to know yours on. But what I want to open with, for those that are tuning in live, wherever you might be finding this, be that Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, where else are we? Twitch, Facebook. Did I say Facebook? Probably Twitter. What's your thoughts on? That Katie's saying it was really enlightening. Yeah, we've got a number of people that have already tuned into that, but it's also going to be cast onto all of our podcast platforms, etc., on Sunday and YouTube and things like that. So yeah, if you missed it, then there's going to be a number of ways you can catch it, but it's still on Facebook, of course. So yeah, lots of great feedback for that. So thanks, Katie. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and many others did. What I want to know your take on at this point in time is, and I'm going to sort of not rant, but riff on my take on MSK CPD and the state of the nation type stuff. But I want to know your thoughts. Like, where do you think we're at the moment? And that can be over whatever level of analysis, be that a few months or year or whatever. Where are we at? It can be related to the sort of post-pandemic situation, or it can be more general. But I just want to know your thoughts on it. Really, do you think it's in a healthy state? Do you think it's sort of cluttered? Do you think it's too niche, too vague, whatever? I'm interested in your thoughts. So if you're listening live, please post your comments. And I'm interested in what your thoughts are on MSK CPD. Mine are, and I nearly even put this in the show's sort of description today, was that, and it just seemed a bit inflammatory for it to be in the description, but equally it'd be bottling it if I didn't at least say it, is that my take on MSK CPD is that essentially I think that most of it is crap. And that's one of the things that sort of fuels my fire. I mean, there's a lot of people out there, no doubt, that think that everything that we touch is crap. And so it's not for me to sort of not acknowledge that these things are down to taste. But it's one of the things that means that I've stayed in this game, and that my team are passionate about education, clinical education, and also just producing content that is going to progress people via knowledge. And that's why we're sort of in it, but it's also why I started it. And I will come back to, what's one of the relevant to talk about, one of the triggers that started Physio Matters, because sometimes people don't know that story unless they've heard me interviewed by, I think there has been something I have shared, but they might not have heard about why I started Physio Matters. And that's relevant because some of that still applies. But generally speaking, yeah, I do think that there's large parts of it that are crap, and it usually falls under two categories really. And I try and produce content that's constantly held up against those filters, and sometimes we make these mistakes, but generally speaking, we try not to do one of these two key failings. One is that it ends up being sort of dry and boring and sometimes over academic, in that it's sort of a legacy of, and I understand why these sorts of events need to happen, but essentially it's where there's this natural scientific conference style of approach to MSK CPD, in which there's just this presentation of work, including the dry statistics, by someone that's been deeply embedded within that space. So they've then been working on a paper or a project or a dissertation or whatever it might be, some sort of thesis, and often really respectful. If I'm sat there, I'm probably interested in that work or the conclusions of it, but the person's then regurgitating it in a format that sort of complies within a scientific conference, in that you just go through, and you're obliged to, having submitted an abstract for it, you're just obliged to go through it in a certain way. And I can't help but find that to be dull, even if the topic is of interest to me. The style and format, and sometimes the way that it sort of shapes and sculpts an otherwise interesting speaker and very interesting person, no doubt, that's had a really interesting journey with this data, with this concept, with this, sometimes it's exposed them to things that they didn't expect. And you just never really get that until maybe sometimes at the end, if they've got a chance to. But often they're just sort of going through this template, which I just find to be dull. And I understand why it's happened. It's a legacy thing. It's not necessarily due to the character or even due to the organisers, but it's just this obligation to sort of comply within this really dry, academic, for want of a better word, of process, a template. And that sometimes then bleeds into the online space or whatever it might be. Is that even interview shows or podcasts or whatever, that sometimes it's just that is the way in which people present their information and their data, etc. And it's, we just sort of succumb to that template approach, and I just find it to be crap. And that's, again, just a matter of taste. There's other people that I know have come to me saying that they, when I started doing in-person events, etc., and we've had it a bit recently with Therapy Live stuff, is that people are wanting to, create a better scientific conference atmosphere around MSK, and asking me if I would be involved in that. And I'm obviously supportive of, when things are declared to be of a certain way and for a certain demographic of delegate, then I'm not averse to it. But I'm just admitting, for my personal taste and where I think that the industry at large needs to go, is that I just think that style is one of the things that's kind of got us in the place that we're at, whereby I'm going to come to the next stage, but by things being that way out, the other side of it is able to flourish because it's just sort of dry and dull. And then this other thing crops up, which is that you've got this cowboy environment, as I often describe it, whereby you've got people that are essentially just pitching their take on a matter from clusters of anecdotes without recognizing the relevant mechanisms of effect that are underneath it. They're sort of a bit guru-centric. There's often a marketing angle to it with regards to either sort of perpetuating their style of care or even associated to gadgets, gizmos, or programs in which, or come and do my level 7 course. By the time you get to level 7, it's almost like this Scientology style approach in which you qualify for the truth if you can eventually go through our model of education long enough, and then it's usually associated then to brands and gadgets, gizmos, etc. And that's something that at one point felt like that was sort of dying out in the CPD space, and then it's kind of come back with a vengeance, in part because there's this really almost like a over empirical scientific regurgitation of facts or conclusions, and spoiling some brilliant characters that would otherwise have really interesting takes. And then this other side is sort of not shying away from just going so far away from what would be sort of evidence-informed sensibility, because they're sort of like, well, that's what the laboratories say. This is in practice. This is what I do. This is what works. And that's why you should get all your patients to buy this particular flavor of shoe or insole or device to roll around on, or this is why this particular ointment, when Mars is aligned with Jupiter, that's why why I get better results than the guy next door in back pain. And there's such a vast difference there where, I have far more sympathy with those that are being sort of dull and overly templated with scientific regurgitation than I do with sort of cowboys that are doing that, even if they are well-meaning in a sense, right? So I'm not talking about charlatans that are knowingly perpetuating mistruths. I'm talking about people that otherwise I think they've got the key answers to these important questions wrong as to what we should be doing in terms of style of, instigating self-efficacy, person-centered care, trying to help people reach their functional goals, all the stuff I often talk about. They're not recognizing that to be the how the sausage is made, that being the core component of care. But they genuinely believe in whatever it is they might be spouting. But that style of education is quite interesting. It's sort of fast-paced. They're often decent with regards to the marketing of it, and they use graphics well and all that sort of stuff. And so it just becomes this. One is sort of very entertaining but light on detail and facts, and one is plenty of facts of the matter, plenty of detail often, but he's not entertaining at all. And so it comes to why I feel like many things succumb to that, and that includes some online content and platforms and subscription models that sometimes make the mistake of being one or the other, right? And there's grades and gradations and stuff, and I'm not saying I always don't make mistakes in that direction. I'm sure we've produced some stuff that people find to be on the whole might have been too dull, too detail laden, too scientifically granular. And then there's other times there's certainly people that accuse me of being one of these sort of raving anecdote based populists that are just spouting stuff based on anecdote. And I try not to be either of those people. Our team are constantly checking ourselves against those things. But I feel that quality MSK CPD especially, but I would say just quality education in general is somewhere between those things, but also is a true third way, which is that you don't shy away from it needing to be entertaining. You're recognizing that people are often digesting this content in their own time, sometimes even a lunch break like this. But equally, it should be based on something. There should be an argument that's there, and an argument that's been exposed to appropriate counter narratives. A point that is being made that would be put up against a counter. So often, what I'm describing as being these cowboys are often doing so. They're not putting themselves forward to people that disagree with them and saying, "Can you challenge me on this?" or really coming up with appropriate representative arguments against other things. And similarly, the sort of really over-empirical scientific dull stuff is just like, well, no, this is the way it needs to be, and really even putting an expression on my face would be a bias, and so I just need to tell you the facts of the matter, and to entertain is cavalier, is bad science, and it's just like, I just think it's clumsy either way, really. So we're trying to do something that's appropriately in between. It doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, but I would unfortunately say that there isn't a majority in that middle ground. I would say that when I look on, especially with what's happened, where people have then had to see less patients or adjust their care, etc., and sometimes they've then flexed into the education space or wanted to do more virtual stuff, virtual events even. It's just that the quantity has massively expanded, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality has then rose. Amongst the quantity, there's some quality. Absolutely. I'm not sort of being smug and not, I'm not pulling the ladder up. I love the fact that people are being creative, and I want to perpetuate quality work, and it raises all standards there. But, generally speaking, I've seen people just flexing into that stage, thinking, well, how hard can it be? And then just throwing stuff out there, and often succumbing to one or both of those mistakes. And weirdly, sometimes they can do both. Is that they've got these dull research review type stuff, and then they've got punting it on an anecdote in the next breath, rarely from the same speaker or but sometimes the same platform, and that disappoints me. I really don't like that. I don't like either of those things. It's why I try to come through the middle of that. And I wanted to hark back to why did Physio Matters start, and I'm not trying to make a case that Physio Matters is therefore perfect and doesn't make those mistakes, but Physio Matters started because I got a new operating system on my phone at a time where me and Charlotte were commuting an hour to an hour and a half each way for jobs that we were loving. We were living in Sheffield. I was commuting to Nottingham and back, and she was commuting to Manchester and back for jobs that were going to provide the foundations for our careers. And so I had this new operating system on my iPhone. Podcast that was sort of front and center. So I just typed in Physio or MSK, I can't remember what it was, or it was just sort of a healthcare pain injury, I don't know what it was, but basically then got a podcast up, and then free of charge, I then commuted the next day, listened to a podcast on the way to work that I was a better physiotherapist for that journey, for having listened to it. Couldn't believe it. I was delivering better care for those patients, having heard a true expert in the field share their latest and greatest ideas in that space. This will be 2013, I imagine. It was maybe 2012. And yeah, just phenomenal. Couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe I hadn't paid for it. I was just checking I hadn't, making sure it hadn't gone through or something, that they hadn't processed it from a text message or something. And then couldn't believe it. Over the moon with it. And then on the way home, same day, on the way home, I then tried to do the same thing. I clicked on another episode and got home, and I was incredibly frustrated because I had the same experience of having information shared with me and as an interview format, but it turned out that on the way there, the person that being interviewed was quality and credible and was sharing well-balanced views, and on the way home, it was just Cowboy Central. And it was just that the style of interview that was being done wasn't meaning that they weren't necessarily challenged them on falsehoods, as far as I could see it and tell, is that they were just perpetuating falsehoods and not being challenged on it. And it drove me crazy. So I went in and ranted and told this story to Charlotte, my now wife, and said, like, this is mad. I went to work, I couldn't believe this, how brilliant it was. But then it turned out that the only reason it was so brilliant was because it's the guest selection. They just shared their message and shared a great message. And on the way home, the other therapist that was on the other side of the interview was full of shit. And it was like, there wasn't anything there that was appropriately, doing basic journalistic skills to just challenge them on stuff, but maybe close enough to the knowledge or the evidence themselves to really elicit that. So I'm whinging about it, and Charlotte said, "Well, could you do better?" I fancied myself in saying, "Yeah, but I bet I could." And so I bought some microphones, and there we went. We went at a time where we'd just started a consultancy service with Choose Health, doing second opinion work and stuff like that out with sports clubs. So I got some microphones, attached it to that a little bit, and we had a new website which was due, so we bolted it onto that. And so that's how Physio Matters was born. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is because it's not dissimilar in many ways. I mean, I hadn't been exposed to over-empiricism necessarily at that point as much in my career. And certainly that story doesn't talk about that dryness and dullness I was talking about, but certainly why Physio Matters exists is to try and offer a critical analysis to stop people being able to just shoot the shit left, right and centre in such a cavalier way. And that even when I do something like that, or any of our guests do it, sometimes maybe people accuse us of that, then it's certainly, we're wrong by accident, as I often describe, and that we're often, our biggest critics, we'd have them on the show. It's something that we really want to make sure that we're challenged on where people perceive us to be going wrong. But that's my take on that. MSK CPD. Do I think it's in good shape or not? I don't know, really. I feel like the majority, I'm admitting that I feel the majority of stuff that's out there is crap. For those reasons, it falls into one or both of those categories. And there's plenty of good stuff out there too, but it's sometimes hard to wade through the crap to get there. So a fairly bold opinion maybe for some, but I'm interested in your thoughts. Let's have a little look at what you guys are saying in the comments section. So thank you for those of you that have got in touch. Let's have a little look. Right, so Mark Scarsbrook, I have separate thoughts about modality-based CPD versus soft skills. But if you're going to do modalities, surely there should be a standard assessment criteria to test for competency. Oh, that's a really interesting point. Certainly come back to that. Kate Napton, some fabulous Physio Network monthly reviews, normally high quality, and gives quick overview of latest papers. Yes, certainly heard great things about those and experienced plenty of them myself. Jim and Tom have done them from our team, for example. And I know we're doing some work with them, with MSKR, and Andrew Cuff is doing something with MSKR with them, which is good. Matt's then added, is there a misconception that a good therapist or a good scientist is automatically a good teacher? Teaching skills different to presenting skills should be studied. Yeah, I think there is an assumption there. I think that's fair. And sometimes we see and witness good work that's written and good science that's done, that then you get them on behind a microphone, or you then look them up and look at whether they've presented that work to consider them for things like Physio Matters or Therapy Live, etc. And you find that they are wanting as a speaker. I think there's something that's to be said for, I don't think everything physiotherapy shouldn't be taught to teach, really, into professional. It comes to sort of coaching and teaching skills, the way that at the center of our care delivery now. I think there's something to that, and obviously I'm a very much a student of Mike Stewart there, my first clinical mentor, and someone who's a great friend of mine, and someone that feels that those sort of basic pedagogy skills need to be central to our care delivery. But I also think that there's some physios that when it comes to public speaking, or I've got some of the best therapists I know, some of the best therapists that work with us are last thing they want to do is shoot the shit like this down a camera, and I'd never put them in that position because they just don't want to teach or share, not just in that format, but teach or share full stop. It's just not their interest. And so it's, I wouldn't say necessarily all, which I know that's not what Matt's saying, but I think there is that. He's just asking about that assumption, which I think is a really fair point. Evie, good afternoon. She's then said, if one guest is full of shit, but likely to tempt a large audience to an otherwise great podcast, it's a difficult one. Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's what's, I don't mind, it's all, like I said, people are often wrong by accident. We're not talking about charlatans. So I'm not averse, and sometimes we're criticized for not having people that are full, I'm calling full of shit on the podcast, and to challenge them and to talk it out. But it's not. I'm not really on about that. I suppose when I see some content, it's more that someone's full of shit, and the audience, the interviewer is not necessarily exposing the audience to a counter narrative. They're sort of waving it through as if it's sort of sensible, and especially when that's on a channel in which it might have had some credible people, then that frustrates me. Similarly, we don't want to have a completely adversarial show. We want to perpetuate good ideas, and that's one of the things that's meant that we've not really done that, where we've done these almost like expose style critical interviews. Also, the people that are vulnerable to that, who I'm saying are full of shit, they usually know enough to not want to put themselves under that scrutiny. Sometimes we've reached out to people saying, do you fancy backing that up on air? And they're not into it. So that is a shame, but it happens. Jim March. Is there a difference between big multi-presenter conferences versus individual seminars? I feel I can take a bigger risk on content and delivery style at 45 minutes at a conference than teaching a day course because of expectations and cost to attendees. I think that's fair. The format of the content you're delivering is going to influence things, and I think that's a really interesting point. And I certainly noticed that myself as an educator, is that the context of which you're delivering it really matters. So no, it's a really interesting point. I want to go back to Matt's point about modality-based CPD versus soft skills. I don't find myself having, I mean, you can have separate thoughts. I suppose it depends what the separate thoughts are, and I'd be interested in, typically I'll probably get Matt to unpack that, maybe even on air. But I would say that I don't really like to separate those things off, because I don't necessarily see them as being so different, apart from maybe the specifics. So if we're doing something where you're literally teaching people how to do a Lachman's test or something like that, or teaching people what is an appropriate use of touch in, massaging a thigh, right? You're going to have something that inherently needs to be practical. And so I do accept that there's a relevant difference there. But when it comes to actually the way in which things are educated, between those 2 points where I was saying about not being with Lachman's or use of touch, you could talk about the granular detail of evidence until the cows come home. And then on the other side, you could just sort of play fast and loose with those two things and saying, it doesn't really matter. Imagine saying it doesn't really matter how you do it. It doesn't really, you're not really talking about Lachman's as if it needs to be a certain way, or what you're even testing, or someone making an argument that, well, yeah, Lachman's is known as an ACL test, but actually I use it for testing all the internal structures, really, and I just rag about on it on a few different angles, and so they're going completely counter to the science, I suppose, is where I'm concerned, and that's why I'd say that the style of balance that I'm describing, that needs to be sort of accurate, but then also don't be shy to be appropriately entertaining and human, and using examples and anecdotes as well as carrying through how your application of that work is done. That's where I really feel would be the appropriate balance of that. So I noticed that we've spent more time on that than I probably anticipated. I went off on one maybe. Hope it's been interesting, but certainly something that I'm passionate about. Last 5 minutes, then I want to sort of touch on, and it can sort of tee us up for future questions and see what you guys think. But people asked after if I'm interested in sort of moral philosophy, etc. How does that map onto my job roles? There's a number of different examples. One of the most obvious examples that's happened clinically recently is that you've got people interested in the philosophy of causation and the philosophy of science and the way in which sometimes the inference and the priors that can exist whereby people think that for something to cause something, and they often use the example, say, of smoking causes cancer, and the way in which data and experiences can then help us to link those things so strongly that we can declare things as being causative. And the Cause Health Project, of which I've been a big cheerleader for, and we covered their conferences, especially early doors, it's something that's made sure it appropriately challenges the fact that essentially there are so many different factors that can mean, especially there's something that is has of a disposition or is of a disposition to be I won't say vulnerable, but subject to different factors that can then influence whether or not it's not necessarily a unified thing or one thing that would cause something, but instead things can contribute to and err towards or err against. And there's some really good work that's been done in that space. And that's been valuable in many ways. And I suppose an obvious way in which a better knowledge of philosophy can help to, at the very least, stop people making bold claims about things that they do or don't do to be inherently causal, and recognizing the multiplicity of factors in play. I think at the very basic level, that work has really helped people to understand that it's almost opened up a more true form of holism, which is what Matt Phillips talked about for those that tuned into yesterday's show. For me, I think another example that I'd like to use on a policy level and how you influence change on a macro thing, rather than just with patients or with a small group in education, but when I'm looking at when we're broadcasting to thousands, or trying to influence policy through MSKR and my director's hat on for the think tank, is that it really seems to matter to me, the sort of philosophy that and even some of the fairly ancient wisdom in many ways as to the nature of self and the human nature and what that means. The biological come sociological influence, there's nature versus nurture factors. And for me, one of the most interesting things that I witness is that it really matters. People's ideology really matters when it comes to their take on human nature, especially when it comes to something that are humans inherently good or inherently bad? Really seems to matter. It's rare that it comes up in that form, but when it comes to someone's instinctive take on what is the baseline characteristic of humans, and when it comes to philosophy, if people are sad enough like me to want to look into that, then you'd look at someone like Thomas Hobbes, I think a 17th century philosopher, Scotsman, was someone that felt that, and he wrote Leviathan, and in Leviathan he was describing the fact that its core premise is that people are inherently bad and then get civilized by society. And you can imagine about the things that come downstream of that philosophy and the politics of it and things, is that he felt that people are born inherently bad and would otherwise be inherently bad unless they were civilized by society. And then Thomas Rousseau, who's a French philosopher slightly later, 18th century, a bit of a celebrity at the time, but Rousseau is that humans are inherently good and get corrupted by society. And there's plenty of philosophy and politics and things that come downstream of that core notion. And it's something that if someone is hard and fast in one of those camps, then you can so understand how that would influence their take on matters. And I experience that on a regular basis when thinking with my MSKR hat on, is that people's sort of instinctive take on the nature of things, the broader analysis, really that makes a difference. And so understanding people's priors, their dispositional interests in that space is really valuable for me. I'll talk about it another time because I know we're out of time if people are interested. But for me, I'm strongly in opposition to either of those takes. I don't think that we are inherently good or inherently bad as humans. Instead, I think we are inherent. I think we have a human nature that is incredibly relevant and is sometimes overlooked for sociological reasons. For displaced for sociological factors. But I think we have a human nature, but I think we have a disposition to good and evil. We can be both, and I think that that's something that is fairly comfortably, and where it overlaps certainly with the evolutionary biology and the study of primates, etc., has really assisted an understanding of that philosophy. But for people that are really of an opinion that they're very Hobbesian or Rousseauian, is Rousseauian the thing? Of that ilk, where they are really feeling like you're either born corrupt and get civilized, or you're born pure and then get corrupted. Incredibly relevant to how people think. And so just as one example of how philosophy influences my thinking and certainly maps onto my work, less so, I would argue, clinically, probably that one, but certainly my work as an educator, a broadcaster, a commentator, and certainly as a director of a think tank that is trying to move for positive change and promote policy. It really seems to matter to me. So I'm interested in your thoughts. I know, as ever, I talk fast and we've run out of time, but it's all to do with whether or not you guys are interested in it, or if there's anyone that you want me to chew it over those themes, or you might never want me to talk about philosophy again, which is absolutely fine as well, I understand. So thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate you as ever. Fortunately, I've at least got Evie saying that she really enjoyed the talk around the practical importance of philosophy. That's nice. At least I got someone. So interested in the thoughts from the rest of you. But lots of love. Top guest tomorrow. Tom Jesson's on the show. What a hero he is. We're going to talk a little bit about sciatica, a little bit about some of the social media opinions he has and how he uses some tech filters to sort of filter the noise. And hopefully we can learn from Tom and be more Tom Jesson at the end of that show. So really excited to have him on the show tomorrow. And then Friday, we've got a bumper show as well. Joe Turner's going to be talking a lot about self-care, coaching and aspiring to be better and fulfilling potential and things like that. She's a physiotherapist and life coach. He's going to be absolutely phenomenal on Friday. So please do tune in to that on Friday. But yeah, 2 top guests Thursday, Friday. So hope you've enjoyed this show as well, even though it's been guestless. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.